You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Billy Galanko, and we have a Bordeaux-focused episode for you today. Very timely, in fact, with the release of the 2017 Chateau Latour just this week. We have Jane Anson, the Bordeaux-based author, critic. She's written the essential guide, the tome about Bordeaux called Inside Bordeaux, which I have right here and will be referencing here in a moment. She's also written Bordeaux Legends, which is a kind of guide on the history and the background of the first gross. I actually just got my hands on a copy of this week, and I'm very excited to dive in. And we have Jane, actually now friend of the podcast, back on for her second interview. So if you want to hear her talk a little bit more about her Inside Bordeaux and what she's doing there, as well as her website, which is janeanson.com, I highly recommend everybody go there to check out a broad range of wine news, as well as insider takes and critiques on the wines of Bordeaux. But before we jump into our interview with Jane, I want to talk a little bit more about what she highlighted at the beginning of her last book and focused on through the Inside Bordeaux, which is the terroir of Bordeaux. Nobody really talks about terroir when it comes to Bordeaux. They talk more about the classifications. Most people think when they hear terroir, they think Burgundy. I really liked how she dove into terroir as a whole inside Bordeaux. But then what she really also put a focus on is the soils themselves. So for this episode, I'm not really going to get into all of the nitty gritty, no pun intended, but I will talk about the four main types of soils that she highlights and talk about the soil type to look for in certain types of growing season, what regions are typified by these types of soils, the best grapes, and the great years that go along with them, as well as some benchmark estates. So without belaboring the point anymore, we'll dive into the four main types of soils of Bordeaux. The first is calcasol on hard limestone. I forgot to give everyone a warning that basically the names of the soil types are very scientific. So we have a descriptor and the scientific name. Calcasol on hard limestone, basically all calcasol means is a calcareous-based soil, a limestone-based soil. And then on hard limestone talks more about the nature of the bedrock that is underneath. So for these calcasol on hard limestone, the type of years you want to look for wines grown in the soil, they're dry years such as 2003, but also good in rainy years as highly efficient water regulator. That's one of the beauties about limestone, as it will absorb and hold rain in the wintertime when it comes, or when it does rain, even during the growing season. But it's porous, so it'll also allow excess water to run off when kind of those reserves are full or when too much rain comes at a single time. The regions that are typified by this type of soil are parts of the limestone plateau of Saint-Emilion. And then with that, grape varieties that grow best there are Merlot and Cab Franc. Great years to look out for are 2015, 2010, and 2000. Estates that really embody this type of soil are Chateau Canon, Belair Monage, and Clos Forte. These soils can also be found in Fronsac and Barsac. And if you were to get Jane's book, she has brilliant maps in here that kind of outlines the little pockets of these soils, because while she gives you an overview of where the main regions are, what's typified by them, there are little pockets of many of these soils throughout Bordeaux. So you're able to use these maps and find out exactly where they are. The next type of soil she discusses here is in the four main types is calcasol, again, on soft limestone. So it's the difference is the bedrock is softer limestone as opposed to the hard limestone before. Again, you look for this soil in dry years. This one can be a bit more difficult in the rainy years. It's a little bit harder for the drainage on that soft limestone. So keep it more on the dry years. It's typified by regions of Fronsac and the Côte, as well as Saint-Emilion Côte. Best grapes, again, are Merlot and Cab Franc. Great years to look for wines on this soil are 2015, 2010, 2005, and 2000. A couple of the benchmark estates to look for here are Chateau Le Vieil-Cure, Larcis Ducasse, Fombrage, and for whites, Clos Fleuridien. Now we're moving on from limestone to more of the heavy hitters, the ones that everybody really knows and loves. And when they think Bordeaux, they probably think of these two soil types. So the third soil is our deep clays, planisols. The type of growing season you want to look for these soils in are basically they almost always perform well. Part of that is that clay is good at holding water. And then the other part is when you get the really sticky clays, when they get really wet, they expand and they don't let any more water in. So it's hard to really waterlog the roots there. And she makes a note here that when you get into looser clays, they're a little bit more difficult in rainy years because there will be pockets of clay within kind of a mix of soil, and that clay will again hold on to the water really well, but without it being uniform and covered, that could lead to some pockets of really moisture underneath rotting some roots where you don't want it, as opposed to having a nice uniform sticky clay 100% soil that kind of expands and contracts as the water comes in and goes out. What region is typified by these deep clays? Pomerol. I think everybody's mind goes to Pomerol and they think of clays. The best grape, Merlot. If you think of a benchmark estate, Petrus. Great growing years for this type of soil, 2015, 2009, 2001, and 1988. Interestingly, the other appellations that have similar terroir, Chateau Latour, a lot of clay, and also noted is Coste de Tournelle, with 30% of the vineyard being these heavy clays. So that's really interesting to think of these two other high quality estates also pulling some of their quality and their style from these deep, rich, sticky clays. And then last but not least, we are on to the gravels, the parasols as they are known. You look for these vintages and medium to late ripening years, where sunshine continues into October. These are typified by the riverside communal appellations in the Médoc. The best grape varieties are Cabernet Sauvignon on the left bank, Cab Franc on the right bank, and Merlot in parts of Pomerol. So all of Pomerol is not all clay. There are some gravels in Pomerol as well. Great years to look for this type of soil, 2016, 2010, 2005, 1990. A couple benchmark estates, obviously the first gross in Pauillac, in particular Lafitte and Mouton, and then also Leoville-Las Cases. Another top producer and a different side of the river to think about as well, same terroir, different appellation, is Chateau Figeac. It's really interesting to think of the right bank may be known for a lot of clay, a lot of limestone, but also there are some pockets of gravel. And Chateau Figeac has a lot of that and really helps power and shape their wines. A lot of the top gross are really focused on a few soil types in particular. Almost all of the classified gross in the Médoc are on the gravels, the parasols, as well as most of the Cru Classé Grave. I think that is where I want to leave it for everyone. But what I would like the main takeaway to be for this is that the soil really does matter. It really has an impact on the structure, the shape of a wine. Bordeaux also, and if you really want to get into the weeds here and talk about the different types of gravel, Jane goes on to talk about the different terraces on especially the left bank of these different gravels that have been deposited over the years from different glacial movements, erosion periods, and each of these different 6 terraces has different types of pebbles. The stones came from different regions. There's a distinct size to a lot of them. It's really interesting to think about how these deposits, how these little nuances change from vineyard to vineyard, how certain appellations and classifications have identified these organically over the years. And the wines have come into their own and shown really a lot of nuance. I think is something that the wines of Bordeaux don't get as much credit for as they should. And I think that Jane's book really does a great job of highlighting some of these nuances and will really start educating consumers that you're not just thinking about what the name on the label, the history, the classification is. You're thinking about why that wine got classified in the first place. We all know that it was at the prices at the time of the 1855 classification, but why were those wines commanding higher prices at their time? Again, if you go back to the book that I always reference here, The Story of Wine by Hugh Johnson, he also references that a lot of the top parcels, especially on the left bank, were quickly identified. And it wasn't a surprise that a lot of them had very similar characteristics in terms of soils, depending on what was trying to be grown there. So I just want everybody to take away that interest in Bordeaux soil types and terroir in general. And now I want to touch on the Bordeaux Mentor Week 2024. The applications are now open through the end of the month. What Jane and the team are trying to do is basically select people from around the world, young individuals who are trying to break in to the wine industry and maybe have a lack of access to mentors or older wines to taste or just a knowledge of the industry. Maybe you're working at a wine shop and you want to really supercharge your career in wine, or you're working at a local winery and you want to get more hands-on experience or broaden your frame of reference. I think this is a really great opportunity. Jane and the team bring 7 individuals from around the world into a week of intensive learning, hands-on experience, focused on the wines of Bordeaux, from harvest to blending to production to tasting to marketing and navigating distribution channels. The individuals who are selected will be guided by 2 leading Bordeaux experts and a select group of industry partners. So this is, again, their 3rd edition of the Bordeaux Mentor Week. It'll be in September. Applications are now open. You can find them on her website on janeanson.com, or if you just Google Bordeaux Mentor Week 2024, they're bound to pop up. Jane talks more about this in our interview, but I encourage everybody who maybe knows somebody who's trying to break into the industry to apply. It is a really great opportunity. But now, without further ado, we will have our interview with Jane Anson, where we discuss her recent trip to China, tasting Marselan, what Marselan tastes like, and some of the best estates coming from China. Also her experience with growers growing Marselan in Bordeaux, where it is also allowed now. And then we dive in more into how Bordeaux is transforming, how some of the recent vintages are showing what the 22 is tasting like, what the 2023 growing season was like, what vintages she really thinks are showing well right now, her expectations for prices and on per more, and a lot more. So without further ado, here is Jane Anson. Hi, Jane. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Billy. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, since this is your 2nd time on the podcast, you're officially a friend of the pod. So we really appreciate you coming back on.
Thank you. And it is beautiful weather in Bordeaux today. It's been raining non-stop. I don't know if you've seen pictures, but the whole city has basically been underwater. And the last 2 days, the sun's come out and it feels like spring.
Oh, wow. But that overall winter rain bodes well for the vintage, right? So that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, you're right. Oceanic climate, there's always some rain in winter here, but it has been particularly ferocious the last week or so.
I'm glad it's coming before bud break and before anything else happens that could be an issue. Awesome. We're so excited. I'm sure everybody, or a lot of our listeners, probably have a sense of who you are, read a lot of your work. But could you give us a little background on who you are and what you've been up to lately?
Certainly. I have been living in Bordeaux for the last 20 years, incredibly, from the UK originally. And I'm author of 4 or 5 books, mainly about Bordeaux. I did a book called Wine Revolution about the world's best organic biodynamic wines, according to my selection of them. But the most recent book I've done is called Inside Bordeaux, and it's a 800-page humdinger about this whole region, talking through wine styles, the history, looking at the terroir, trying to bring the conversation on in Bordeaux to give it a slightly more contemporary and I hope interesting take.
Yeah.
I should add that I launched my own site 2 years ago, so janeanson.com. So I used to be Decanter's Bordeaux correspondent, and then I've launched my own site where basically it's a companion to the book. So the book does a lot of the background to the different chateaus, and on the site it's more about a lot of up-to-date tasting notes and just making sure that everyone's on top of what's happening right now.
Yeah. I have my copy right here. It's a great book. Excellent. I hope everybody has checked it out since our last conversation. I would also add that you're maybe not critic is not necessarily the right word, but you also have wine reviews, and people can probably find those on a lot of different websites when they're buying wine. That might be the main touch point. A lot of people have come across your name if they're not having this book yet or some of your other books. So
yeah, I hope so. And that's something that's been great with the site as well, is getting my notes, having more visibility across different stores.
Awesome. I guess we have a number of topics actually to cover today. Where would you like to start? Do you want to start in Bordeaux, or do you want to start in some of your recent activities over in China?
It could be fun. I've just come back from a week of tasting in the inaugural Chinese Wine Awards. Before I lived in Bordeaux, I lived in Hong Kong for about 3 years back in the 90s, at just really around the time of the handover. And over the years, I've been back into China quite a lot to visit the different wine regions and to hold tastings and things. So it was super exciting to be at the first edition of this new competition, which was created by a guy called Eddie McDougall, who's known also as the flying winemaker. He's Australian, makes wines in many different countries. And he thought it was the right time after all the closures. China obviously closed for a long time because of COVID and longer than most of us, and opened back up, and to see what's happening with the Chinese wine industry today. So we had, I think there were maybe 40 judges. We were judging 800 wines from 200 different wineries. So they introduced a lot of different labels, and across, I think, 14 different regions of China. So it was a great kind of way to check in on what was happening.
Awesome. Where there's a couple questions I have. One is, I've heard, obviously, and I think it's well documented, even some of the wines coming into the US, the quality overall has dramatically increased. But I've also read that there's maybe a focus or a more identification of the varieties that may grow best in China, and then people really leaning into that more. Have you seen a little bit of that?
Yeah, so that's been really interesting. I think let's think of the Chinese wine industry as it stands. It has been making wine in China for millennia. There have been examples of wine being made for many centuries. But if we think of the modern wine industry, maybe 15 years is probably a realistic time span for the real modern wine industry. And when it got started, and so with many places, there was a lot of Cabernet going in. There was a lot of Bordeaux varieties going in. Often Cabernet is a grape which is used to establish prestige in upcoming regions and to have potential money coming in. So that was very much the first wave of Chinese wine. And I think you're absolutely right. What we've seen over the last 5 years, maybe decade, is people starting to do more interesting soil studies to see what are the best varieties that actually work in the region. And among the best varieties that I was tasting last week, I would say Marselan. Marselan has got a great future in China. You see it quite often as a blend with Merlot or with Cabernet Sauvignon. But even on its own, some of the best wines I tasted last week, we don't know the results yet. The results come out on April the 13th. And I have no idea what I was tasting. But we knew the grape variety and we knew the region. And I got some excellent Marselan from the Hebei, as they kept telling me to pronounce it, Hebei province, and also Ningxia, which obviously is the most well-known Chinese wine region. And it was great. But what's been interesting as well is, as the Chinese economy itself has contracted, so has the wine industry. The way the Chinese government will record it, there are maybe 800 wineries in total in China, but the ones that are seen of as being at a reasonable size, which I think means a turnover of 250 million euros, I think that's right, at that size, at the height in 2017, you had about 250 of them at that big size. And today there are about 105, maybe 110 that are included at that kind of the size seen as being a medium to large winery. So that tells you a lot about what's happened. I think there's been a lot of clearing out of wineries that started and maybe didn't have what it took to go the distance. And although there's been a contraction, from my experience of tasting last week compared to when I've gone to China to taste before, I came across far less faults. I came across far less problems of oxidation or of TCA or of all of these things that can happen if you're making wine without the sufficient technical support. So I think what we're probably going to find in China over the next decade is, and we've seen it again and again, there's an incredible ability to react and learn and do well within the culture. And so I think we're really going to see some excellent Chinese wine coming out into the world over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because we've had Chess Martin from Nobility on to talk about the Asian market as a whole. And then we've had Mike Veseth, who's like the wine economist, and he was giving us his point of view on the Chinese wine market. And he was noting the contraction, but I hadn't really considered until you brought it up there, the quality also rising or increasing. Do you think that maybe some of what I've read is basically the consumers are looking for more mid-price wines now, but do you think the consumer in China looking for Chinese wines are becoming more discerning, or they're trying to, since they have less to spend, they're trying to spend it on something that may be more quality? Or is this different more from the government and looking for quality there?
I think very often what happens in China is driven by government policy. Certainly, if you look at Ningxia as a wine region, one of the main reasons that Ningxia is such a successful wine region in terms of numbers is not necessarily because it's the ideal climate, it's because it has had the most support by far from its local government in terms of supporting plantings, and also in terms of things like supporting a university where you can learn and train to be a winemaker. There's all kinds of government support going into Ningxia. And I think what I found in this competition was we had rosés, we had orange wines, we had a lot more whites than I expected. We had sweets, we had reds. And that is driven from the consumer, from what I understand. And it's driven from consumer demand rather than coming top down from the government. So that's interesting. I think that is something that's maybe unexpected. And yes, I'm sure it's to do with, I think there's a younger demographic who are drinking wine generally in China. There's more women drinking wine generally in China. Those who might well be more interested in a wider range of not just heavy tannic red wine. And I think it's a young evolving industry. We're going to see a lot of changes. A lot of the winemakers today who maybe 20 years ago had only been making wine in China, now they go out regularly. They're doing harvest in Margaret River or in Napa or wherever, and then coming back to China. So there's a much greater exchange. Ironically, after this closure, this 2 or 3 years closure over COVID, which I am sure, no matter what they say, I'm sure that set the industry back a little bit, because it wasn't just not being able to go out to Australia or to France, but also crossing the different regions of China. It was very difficult during the COVID years. So I'm sure that has set the industry back a bit. But it's the biggest grape grower in the world. Not all wine grapes, obviously. I think it's only 15% of that is wine grapes. But there is a real hunger for this industry to work, to succeed. It's a way to keep a lot of often areas which are low value agricultural areas that can't grow other things. China has a lot of its regions which doesn't have a lot of water supply, which is a problem for many agricultural products, but not such a problem for wine. So there is a definite hunger for the wine industry to work in China.
And I found it interesting what you were saying there with the orange and rosé wines coming in, or at least you're seeing some now. I think personally those pair much better with more traditional Chinese food. My fiance is Taiwanese, and we eat a lot of traditional Chinese food, and I'd never think to pair with a big red wine, but I think some of those wines could be much more approachable and enjoyable. But also knowing that the culture doesn't necessarily consume a lot of their liquids at the same time as they're eating, they're separate. I still think it could be a good
yeah,
partnership.
I totally agree with you. And you're right, because so much, there's usually many different textures and tastes, etc., going on when you're eating a traditional Chinese meal. It's very difficult to do traditional food and wine pairing anyway. I would say that of the rosés that I tasted last week, I didn't find many there was a lot of residual sugar going on. It was definitely a very different style of rosé, but certainly there's a lot of experimentation going on. But my big suggestion is to look out for the Marselan.
Nice. And on that note, Marselan it's a crossing of Grenache and Cabernet Sauvignon. Is that right?
Yeah,
awesome.
Exactly.
And was that created in France? Where was that?
Yeah, I think it was created in France like a long time ago, like in the 30s or 40s. But it was first planted in China. Oh, I do have that date. I think it was first planted in China. In fact, hang on, can you just hold for 1 second while I find that, because it is quite recent. Hang on a second.
Yeah. While you're pulling that up, my follow-up question to this was also going to be: have you had any Marselan that wasn't from China, and how does it compare?
Oh, cool.
But I would.
Yeah. Okay. I do. Yeah. I can answer that. Okay. So I've got it. So Marselan was first planted in China in 2001. So that is, relatively recent, wow. But then again, at the beginning of when a lot of grapes were going in. And it was planted at Domaine Franco-Chinois, which remains one of the real high quality estates today. I don't know if it was in the competition, but I know that I tasted a number of their wines while I was over in Macau, and there's some really excellent whites and reds. Anyway, so this was planted then, and it was only, I think, 2 hectares went in 2001. And now you have 300 hectares of Marselan in China. And I understand that more and more of it is being planted in Bordeaux as well. So it's allowed in Bordeaux. It's one of the great varieties, but now that they're loosening up a little bit, Marselan is one of them. I can't say I've tasted many, or for any in Bordeaux that have really stood out to me. I've more tasted samples because they're allowed as blends, and they're not allowed as 100% in Bordeaux right now. But I know that there's a couple of consultants here who are strongly supporting it, particularly as a blend with Merlot, and hoping to get more of it in the vineyard.
As when it's made into a varietal wine, what does it express like for some of us who haven't really had it before?
So one of the things that I think why it works well in China with this, one of the reasons why they like Cabernet is because Cabernet is quite structured and it's deeply coloured. So Marselan has that deep colour that you get with Cabernet, but it's much fleshier. It's actually a kind of a naturally sweeter, at least the ones that I was tasting and really enjoying last week. They're kind of blackberry and brambled fruit and really quite beautiful, deep, purpley, ruby colour. And the tannins are just slightly less powerful, it seemed to me, than the Cabernet tannin. So I think it answers a lot of the desire to have a wine which looks deeply red and it looks very powerful and inviting, but actually aromatically and on the flavour profile, it's a little easier to approach.
That's really interesting. I'm excited to try some. I'll have to.
Yeah, I really recommend it.
Here.
It was definitely for me. It was a really fun discovery last week.
Cool. On that note of the plantings increasing in Bordeaux and the experimentation, what have you seen since we've last spoken regarding some of these efforts to maybe embrace some of these new varieties? I know there's like at least one Portuguese variety that's allowed to be planted now, or any other sustainability efforts over the past couple of years.
Yeah, that's right. So Touriga Nacional, the Portuguese one that's allowed. My feeling is I'd like them to explore some of the more traditional Bordeaux varieties like Castettes. So Castettes is a variety which was allowed in Bordeaux a lot in the 19th century and which kind of fell out of favour and is not allowed, not in the official original allowed grapes, but is now one of these experimental. I hope that they can find a way to use those varieties which have got a history in Bordeaux. And I actually did a fantastic visit a couple of weeks ago with a guy at an estate called Chateau Casabon. He worked in IT, or he used to run an online wine shop. Anyway, and then he bought this estate and he's planted 50 experimental red and 50 experimental white varieties to see what's going to work. So a lot of them would have to be bottled as Vin de France. So even with the experiments, they're not part of that. But it was so interesting going to chat to him. There's a real feeling of people wanting to move forward this conversation and to try and connect. Again, it's a way to connect with a whole different generation of people about Bordeaux, to get away from the idea of it being just so set in its ways and so traditional. But I can say since we last spoke, there's been a lot of not good news about Bordeaux. I'm sure we've all been seeing all of these demonstrations that have been happening all over France because of issues with farmers, definitely not just winemakers, but it's been super, super tough for people. And there's been a big program in Bordeaux to uproot vines to try and balance supply and demand a little bit more. And when I moved to Bordeaux in 2003, there were about 120,000 hectares of vines. So double that plus 20% is it for acres. Anyway, it was 120 hectares 1,000 hectares when I moved here. And it's 103,000 hectares now. They have really pulled up a lot of vines over the last 20 years. And even more, just in this last year, we've seen 12% reduction in AOC Bordeaux red vines. So that means that kind of generic, it doesn't mean we're losing 12% of Pauillac or Saint Julien, but it means that kind of entry level of AOC Bordeaux, 12% reduction in a year. That's pretty incredible. So that's a lot of vines brought up trying to balance this idea of letting these entry-level wines be able to make a living. Because the problem right now is the prices are dropping and they're having to sell wines at a way that they're not breaking even on their production costs when they're selling it. So that's the basic problem, is how do they find a way to stop those prices dropping and to ensure that they can sell at a way that allows them to live and to feed their families and to do all the things that we all want to do. And it's quite interesting when you look at it in the context of the French agricultural system as a whole, because I was just looking again at some figures for our conversation. And agriculture is worth 3.5% of the French GDP overall. So that's not a massive amount, although it's 1 million jobs. And but psychologically in France, it is huge. Psychologically in France, people they still eat in a way where they go out to individual shops and they buy their individual thing. Just today, I was out shopping a couple of hours ago, and I went to the greengrocers to get my stuff for my smoothies tomorrow morning. The greengrocers, and then when I had a delicious tart for lunch today, but I went to a specific boulangerie to buy that. That's very much, it's still the mentality that you're connected to the land and that you buy things in season. And so it can be a pain to live here and have all of these, what you call it, manifestation in French, what do we think? These, like you can't go into town because there's a farmer blocking the road or pouring manure in front of the town hall. These things happen regularly over the last couple of months, and it can be frustrating. But at the same time, you can understand it. And there is a lot of support from the French population as a whole to the fact that these farmers have a right to earn enough money to live. And it's hard, I think, to understand from outside of the country just how much it is seen as being the right of the French way of life, basically, to support these farmers. So it's very tough. It's tough for the government to know what to do. But what tends to happen in France is people demonstrate, and they normally get at least some of what they're demonstrating about, at least some of what they're asking about, which is very different from the Anglo-Saxon view, certainly in the UK right now, where there isn't a lot of give and take between what the government says and what the workers want. But in France, there tends to be more of give and take.
What would you think is one of the driving causes for those lower prices? Is it that the climate's been favorable and there's been a lot of great yields in the past 10 years? Or do you think it's more competition from elsewhere in the world? Or what do you think is causing that?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think yields have been actually pretty low the last couple of years because of climate change and more drought. So that maybe hasn't been such an impact. I think it probably is a lot of to do with competition. I think they have to be honest, and a lot of entry-level Bordeaux simply hasn't been good enough. But that then becomes this vicious cycle, because if you're not being paid enough to keep investing in your vine, then how do you make sure that your quality is good enough? That's very tough. The way that Bordeaux is structured, where most estates, at least traditionally, were selling not direct, they were selling through négociants, which then means they're at one level back from their consumer. That makes it very tough when you have competition from other regions that are making good wine at reasonable prices and maybe are closer to their consumer. So that's difficult. I think if you look back to maybe 10 or 15 years, there was this big structural change in Bordeaux where the Cru Bourgeois, those guys, if we take the Medoc, you have this whole area of Cru Bourgeois estates, which tend to be family owned, but they tend to be reasonably good quality and kind of mid-level price. And there was a feeling that they wanted to be sold en primeur, because the en primeur system, which is classically for the big guys, for the classified estate, they get great for cash flow. And those Cru Bourgeois, I think, wanted to be sold that way. So a lot of them stopped selling direct and went to the négociant system. And now that there are all of these problems economically, that's really a headache for them, because they've lost their direct route to market, and the négociants are squeezing them on the price. And it's very difficult for them to make enough money to be sustainable and to keep investing and to do all the things that they want to do. So then they have to try and get out of that system and go back to selling direct. So I think what we're seeing right now is a shakeout. It's not easy. Not everyone's going to survive it. The government will try and help, but how much can they do? It's not easy. But Bordeaux always finds a way through. There might be less of it over the next 10 years, and that's awful for people individually. But Bordeaux as a whole will find a way through it, because that's what it does.
Yeah. Wine tends to be cyclical. So I'd be interested to see if after this period of pulling up vines and some of these other things, maybe those eventually are replaced by some of those new varieties that are allowed pending the circumstances when planting does increase again inevitably.
That would be super interesting. But if you so you have the option, you could just pull up yourself because you think that you haven't got enough market for it. Then you can replant. But if you take government subsidies to pull up, then you're not allowed to replant. I'm not sure how long the timescale is for that. Yeah. I assume it would only be for 10 or maybe 15 years. I'm not sure. But certainly if you've signed up to the scheme and you've taken subsidy, you're not allowed to replant, which I guess makes sense.
That's interesting. Maybe, I'm just trying to think of what else could be wine adjacent that they could do. Maybe that would further the hospitality push that, Bordeaux is pushing to be more welcoming. Maybe
Yeah.
that will lead to more tourism sports or something.
Yeah, that's
Cool.
definitely possible. And I think obviously agroforestry is a big thing. So maybe people would also be planting more of other biodiversity, other things like that can help as well. But I have heard in the last year, in 2023 vintage, there was some issues with mildew. In June of last year, during the growing season, there were some problems with mildew. And I know a couple of, I won't say which ones, but a couple of extremely high quality estates who bought up their neighbors' lands, not because they wanted to farm them, they just wanted them not to be abandoned. So there were vines that were being abandoned because the people couldn't afford to look after it. And then mildew comes along, and that's a big threat to whichever vineyard you're sat next to. So a couple of these really top guys bought those vineyards, and just uprooted them to get rid of those potentially dangerous mildew-affected vines. So it is super interesting right now, just tracking what's happening in the vineyard and seeing, and as ever, sadly, often what it means is the gap gets bigger between the guys who can afford to do that and protect their vines and the guys who, with the best will in the world, are having a really tough time.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess we'll use this as a little transition to talk about the vintages. We're approaching on for more, so I'd like to hear about the 2023 growing season, but also the 2022s are getting closer to being physical. Do you want to talk a little bit about the 2022 vintage and then how 2023 was different?
Sure. I've just finished tasting a lot of the 2021s, and that's been interesting when you look at the contrast. If we think of two vintages that could not be more different, 2021 and 2022. So 2021, very cool, really not very a challenging vintage overall, and 2022, extremely hot. So you had one vintage that's more about cool, fresh fruit, if they're lucky. Sometimes actually a bit of green pepper and not fully ripe enough, but very good for some white wines. And then 2022, which is really a drought vintage. You had unbelievable temperatures for Bordeaux, where you regularly be getting 35 to 40 throughout most of the summer. And then you have all of this kind of trans-evaporation, so very small berries, issues with blockaging. Lucky in a way, 2022 was very lucky that 21 was so wet because there was groundwater. So most of the vines did manage to keep going and survive. But the character of 2022 is powerful big tannins. In the best examples, a lot of fruit and really great structure, but so different to 2021. And what we're seeing with 2023, hopefully, is we're meeting somewhere in the middle of those two things. So 23 was once again a slightly challenging beginning where you had mildew coming in June because of some rains. So you had a strong mildew pressure, but then you had a kind of a cooler summer, but quite a nice summer, but much cooler than 2022. And it wasn't until September and October that the heat really came. So you had this beautiful Indian summer in 23. So it's been challenging, but I think we're going to see some really beautiful Cabernets, particularly because you had to be able to still have your fruit hanging on the vines. You had to be in the game from mid-September onward. And obviously that almost always benefits Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon.
That makes sense. What are you thinking in terms of, I don't know, you're not a producer and you have no control over these, but what are you thinking in terms of EP prices? Do you think they're going to continue to keep going up as everybody is lamenting about, or are they going to shift?
I think this year, the Bordelais are going to read the room and bring their prices back down again. I think we're seeing this same cycle again that we see in Bordeaux, where they always push the prices 1 or 2 years longer than you think they possibly can. And then there comes the point where where market reality hits. And what we've seen is we need the prices, the market needs the prices to go to 2019 or cheaper. I think that is the reality, because 2021 prices were too high for the quality. I really believe that. They were too high for the quality. And so there's a lot of inventory sat out there for that. 2022, there were some brilliant wines in 22. It was atypical. It was not, for me, my favorite vintage in recent years, but I can see there were some very good wines there. And again, highly priced. They haven't moved through in the way that they could have done. I think the Bordelais really missed a trick last year because there was a lot of excitement about those wines. It was different. It was a vintage which kind of confounded expectations. I think we all thought it was going to be like 2003 and as in very right. But in fact, it was right, but it had some freshness and it was well handled. And then they just priced so highly that people lost interest. So you've got now coming into 2023 where there's quite a good volumes. There's enough that they can play with in most cases. Some people were affected by mildew, but most people have got reasonable volume. And the market is saying to them, you're not going to sell if you price the wines as you did the last couple of years. I've got to say, I heard from chateau owners themselves about 2 or 3 months ago telling me we're going to be cutting down 30 to 40% from last year. But what happened every time, as it gets closer to the actual date, I get more cynical that that's what they're really going to do. But I think the reality is, let's look out at the market at the moment. First growths in 2019, they came out at about 285 to 290 euros ex chateau. So not market price, but the price that goes from the chateau to the negociant. So 285, that's the 2019. You go out into the marketplace now and you can get off vintages or reasonable vintages of most first growths at about 400 euros. That is not sustainable for them to bring out an en primeur at that price if you can get older vintages, even recent older vintages at those prices. And what we're seeing in the marketplace right now is that the prices are continuing to go down. We haven't yet found a stable bottom of the market. And even the top chateaux of Bordeaux have to take that into account for this en primeur campaign.
As you were saying, the 2022s were interesting. The 2023s, I'm sure that those prices are they'll say they'll cut 30 or 40% until they get a good rating from one critic, and then they'll jack it up again. But what do you think? You were mentioning vintages from the past 10 years that the 2022s weren't your favorite. What is drinking really right now, or what are some of your favorite vintages that people could maybe be looking out for?
So I think a vintage to look out for right now, and it doesn't mean it's the best vintage in the last 10 years, but it is one which is really tasting lovely at the moment, is the 2017. The 2017, you can probably get some good prices on it because it was so overshadowed by the 15, 16 and 18. So it's one of those ones which kind of falls in the gaps in between these big vintages. Slightly better pricing. And it's a vintage which, like we're 21, for me, really most things didn't get ripe enough. I feel like 21 is not going to age brilliantly, and I wouldn't recommend people buy it. But overall, there are some good wines, but it's not one that I would go to. Whereas 2017, it's a more lighter style in that it doesn't have those huge tannins, but things are right. They have beautiful fruit. There's lovely fragrance. There's really good floral side things. And the balance alcohol-wise is much better. You might find 13.5 alcohol as an average compared to in 2022, you're looking at 14.5 average. So big difference in terms of the structure and the balance of what it tastes like. And I've had so many delicious 2017s recently, and I wouldn't wait forever. So that's why it's a good one to recommend people to look at to be drinking now and over the next 5 years. Some fantastic right bank, particularly like limestone plateau, like Pavie Macan, like Canon or Bel Air Monange, those kind of beautiful wines from the Santa-Emilion limestone plateau, tasting fantastic in 2017 right now. And then if you want to go for a more classic, bigger vintage, I love the 19s. I think they have balance. They're a bit young right now, but I absolutely love them. And if we can squeeze it in, I would still say 2009. 2009, I know that we're going 15 years there instead of 10 years, but 2009 is a brilliant vintage and it's tasting fantastic right now.
I'll have to seek out some of those 2017s and the 19s. I haven't had those. I'm sure the 2009s are still showing beautifully. I had a 2016 Leoville Barton last week, and that was also showing very well as well.
Oh, so, I bet. And was that ready? I wondered if you'd have to be a bit more patient.
Yeah, I don't think it was quite ready. It was drinking fine now, or very well now, but I mean, it wasn't, I think, truly expressing everything it could. I'm excited to go back and revisit that. But now,
I think we could say as well that because prices are falling, now can be a great time to buy if you're smart and you find people that you trust to buy it from. And I mean, there are some great opportunities, I would say, right now.
Yeah, I 100% agree. on that note, I want to pivot a little bit since we're running a little later on time to talk about possibly one of the more important things we're going to talk about today, your Bordeaux Mentor Week of 2024. Can you explain what the Bordeaux Mentor Week is and then what this year's edition will look like?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for asking about this. A couple of years ago, when I launched janeanson.com site, I really wanted to do something a little bit different and to just try and make this site not just about what I was doing as a critic, but in terms of how I could just help to open up a little bit something that I found problematic in Bordeaux, having lived here for so long, which is how closed and how traditional it can be. And also how I know from having lived here and worked here that if you know a little bit about how Bordeaux works as a fine wine region, you actually get a lot of information of how fine wine globally works. There are all kinds of lessons to learn here about the business of wine. Anyway, so I wanted to just do something to help. And I worked with a friend of mine who's called Chinedu Rita Rosa. She is a brilliant woman. She's a Nigerian wine consultant. So she helps estates who are trying to get their wine into the African market. Anyway, and she had lived the experience of being in Bordeaux and experiencing how closed it can be and how tough it can be to break into it. Of course, so I as well, but in a different way. And we thought we came together and we launched this thing called the Bordeaux Mentor Week. And the point of it is to get young people or people who are just starting out in wine, age is irrelevant, but who are starting out in wine and who might have some barriers to entry, whatever those barriers can be, but something that is stopping them progressing. Most typically it will be because they can't afford to travel to get to know wine regions, wherever that would be. So the point of the Bordeaux Mentor Week is not to make ambassadors about Bordeaux, it's to get the secrets of Bordeaux and to make the contacts, to bring people in here. And to what we do is it's like a very fun, but pretty intense boot camp week where we choose 7 people and they'll come and they'll do everything from they make their own blend, they do harvesting, they meet negociants, they meet a lot of startups. We take them for a day to this brilliant incubator where there's lots of startups that are connected to anything around wine. It might be people who are using AI to better understand terroir, or somebody who's doing a wine tourism program, whatever it is, all kinds of things. But just to get that ecosystem around wine and to see that there's not just one path. The wine industry actually has a ton of different things that you can do. And so far, we've had people from India, from Ecuador, from Puerto Rico, from South Africa, from Nigeria, from all over the world, from the States as well. And it's been amazing. It really has been amazing. It's completely non-profit, so we don't get paid for doing it. And we're supported by some charity foundations. So the Gerard Bassett Foundation and the Académie du Vin Foundation, they support us. So it means that all of the people who are coming, all of their flights are covered, all their accommodation is covered. They're put up by chateaus. It's lovely for them as well from that point of view. So this year, they'll be staying at Chateau du Turc in Margaux, which is beautiful. And yeah, it's very full on, but it's wonderful. And what's nice is to see the friendships that are made among the group as well. And it's ongoing. It's 1 week here, but it's an ongoing process. So this year, the Wine Scholar Guild will be offering the Bordeaux Masters program to all of the 7 scholars who come. And me and Chinedu are in contact constantly with the people who've been here before. It's really about making sure that they have contacts and opens up wherever they are in the world, trying to just give them the confidence and the context for taking their career further.
It sounds awesome, like a great experience. What types of maybe current roles are these types of individuals in right now that are training? So
far, probably most people we've had have been sommeliers or people who are working in wine stores. One of the things that I've wanted to open up to this year is to have somebody who's interested in being a wine critic. So someone who is maybe starting out as a wine writer and who would like to specialize a bit more in wine criticism. Because as we know, that is such a tiny pool of people right now, and often with a very similar background and often very privileged background where they've had this exposure to a lot of expensive old wines. And that can be very tough to get. So one of the things that we've done in the last 2 years is we have at least one day where we're concentrating on opening older vintages of Bordeaux. Obviously, I'm used to tasting those wines, so I try and do some tasting with them. And we've done brilliant tastings of things like different terroirs. So the same grape variety from different terroirs to try and hone those tasting skills. And I thought it would be wonderful if we can try and open up just one place to somebody who's interested in taking that a bit further. But to date, most of our people have been working on the commercial side.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think you're spot on. We had William Kelly on a while back too, and he was lamenting how the age of wine critics and how basically he is trying to figure out how to get younger blood into the mix as well, so that there's a variety of points of view and not just one set. But also, I think, especially here in the US, and I'm sure it's even more the case in certain parts of the world, coming across or affording some of those older vintages is very difficult. We talk to a lot of folks from the UK and they'll be like, the UK is such a hub for wine trade. And they'll be like, my grandfather used to open these all the time. And these are wines. If I was introduced to those by my family, that would be great. But some of us have to taste on our own and work our way up. And then it's really hard to find some of these back vintages that are now so expensive also, maybe from like Burgundy or Bordeaux.
Exactly. And I wasn't brought up drinking 1947 Cheval Blanc. That was not my experience when I was growing up. I drank cider when I was a teenager, nothing to do with fine wine. So the same thing for me. But I know from living here that when you get those keys and those shortcuts, even knowing the right vocabulary to talk about these things, it's a way to be taken seriously. And that then translates into hopefully better wages and better, all of these things. It's such a, these things, everything's connected. I think we've both felt very strongly that we've had mentors in our career that have been very helpful for us, and we just want to pay that forward. So the process is happening right now, and it's right through till March 31st. Anybody can apply. It's been tough. Last year we had 300 applications for, in fact, maybe even a little bit more than that, so 7 places. So it's not easy. But this year we have one of our first year scholars who's called Tanmay, who's this absolutely wonderful sommelier from India who works in France. And anyway, he's helping us at the moment. He's going through all of the applications and doing kind of getting it all organized for us. And then we'll be asking the last maybe 20 people to have a video interview, and then we'll make the selection from that.
Oh, wow. So can they just submit an application on the website, or what is the best?
Super easy. So if they go to my site, obviously it's all free. You go to janeanson.com and you can see all of the questions, and you just fill them out and send them on to, I think it's mentorweek@janeanson.com. Very easy.
Oh, perfect. Awesome. I'll definitely be passing that along to some people I think fall in this category. And that's really exciting. I'm interested to see down the line here who some of the alumni of this and what they end up doing, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of them out doing interesting things out in the world.
This has been wonderful. There's again, from our first group of people, we had a guy called Fernando who's from Puerto Rico, and he is working with a wine. So at the time he was working as an engineer and also working in a wine store. And it has been very fascinating and wonderful seeing how much. And again, he's a brilliant guy. I'm sure this would have happened anyway. But it's that idea of people taking you seriously. You come back from Bordeaux and you've had this experience, and then your line manager in the shop says, "Oh, we've got some Bordeaux winemakers coming next week. You're in charge of that." So since then he's done a lot of going to New York and to other places to taste these wines. And you just can see, I think it's a lot about confidence and connection. So much of it.
Yeah. I completely agree from my own perspective or my experiences as well. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Is there anything else that you are currently working on or going to publish soon that you would like people to take a look at, or is just going to janeanson.com?
I have something fun coming up. Within the Inside Bordeaux book, one of the things that we were most proud of doing was these beautiful maps. We have these gorgeous gatefold maps that on one side of the page, it shows the different chateaus, and on the other side of the page, it shows the terroir. And this whole idea of the soils of Bordeaux was something that's quite new that we did a lot of in the book. Anyway, so we have coming out to En Primeur, in fact, so in a couple of weeks' time. And this is going to be very limited edition at the moment because we're just testing if it works. But we have very beautiful new maps that we've put together. So now on one kind of big size, like a wall size poster, you're going to have the map with the geography of the chateaus and then the terroir layered on top of it. So it's a completely new thing that we haven't ever seen in Bordeaux before. You go into any wine store, you always have the two coats and Burgundy on the wall. So we're thinking we can give them a run for their money by having these beautiful new maps of Bordeaux coming out of the Inside Bordeaux map.
Oh, wow. That's really exciting because I feel like, to your point, there's plenty of maps of Burgundy. There's some from Champagne as well, but Bordeaux doesn't really have any of that terroir type map. So cool. Well,
yeah, exactly. They look gorgeous. So I can't wait for you to see them.
Nice. Since they're limited edition, I'll hold off for the first one. No, the main reason is I love all of these maps, and we still live in a small apartment here in LA for now. My fiance would not let me put them up anywhere, so I would just have to look at them on the side.
Admire them first time around.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to have you back, and we'll have to have you on again soon.
Thank you. It's been so nice chatting to you.
All right. That was our interview with Jane Anson. I hope everybody learned a little bit about the state of Chinese wine. Surprise. I hope you learned a little bit more about Bordeaux, the recent vintages, what we can expect for Entrepreneur in 2023 in general. And also, if you know anybody or you are an aspiring young wine professional, please go to janeanson.com and apply for the 2024 Bordeaux Mentor Week. And that is our episode for today. Brady is still on paternity leave. We'll be back soon. That is our episode. We'll be back next week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.